So the esophagus and the stomach are really important in the process of digestion. The esophagus, obviously, because it carries food or the bolus to the stomach from the oral cavity. And then the stomach is going to continue this process of mechanical and chemical digestion. So in this lecture, we're going to start off by looking at the surface anatomy, the position of the esophagus and the stomach. We'll then look at the esophagus and stomach individually, looking at the blood supply and the anatomy of the esophagus within the abdomen. And then we're going to move on to the stomach and look at its structure, talk a little bit about gastric ulcers, how they're formed, and also look at the blood and nerve supply of the stomach. So if we start off with just some nice key facts about the esophagus. Well, the esophagus is a hollow, it's a muscular tube. It's about 25 centimetres long, but obviously this can vary from person to person, and it has a diameter of about 2 centimetres. It's a muscular tube and it carries out peristalsis, and that means this contraction of the muscle fibres allows the food to pass down from the pharynx in your throat to the stomach. To do that, it has to pass through the thorax, and it runs posterior to both the trachea and the heart. So in your neck, most anteriorly, you can feel the trachea, and immediately posterior to that, you have the esophagus, and then it runs directly posterior to the heart. It then opens up into the stomach, which is really this muscular expansion of the gastrointestinal tract. And if you remember from surface anatomy, it's located within the epigastrium and umbilical regions. It can sometimes extend across into the left hypochondrium. And it stores the ingested food, the primary function of it. It also mechanically churns the ingested food into smaller fragments that increase the surface area, allowing for gastric juices to carry out the chemical digestion. And ultimately, it converts this ingested bolus of food into a semi-liquid, which is known as chyme. And this is then expelled into the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, initially the duodenum, part of the small intestines. As we'll see, the stomach can be divided into numerous regions, and we'll look at these in more detail: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. So here, if we look at the surface anatomy for the esophagus and the stomach, we can see we've got our clavicles up here, and we've got our rib cage, we've got our ribs, and we've got the midline. And the esophagus pretty much runs down that midline towards the stomach. And to do that, it has to penetrate the diaphragm, which we'll see in a moment. And then here we can see the stomach tucked under some of those ribs on the left-hand side, this kind of J-shaped muscular sac, which will then be continuous with the duodenum over in this direction. We can see that if we superimpose these kind of cartoons of these images, of these organs, onto the person's torso. We've got the liver here, which is shielding some of the stomach. We can see we've got the esophagus that runs down into the stomach, which we can see here. Then the stomach is going to pass the food into the C-shaped duodenum, which is the first initial part of the small intestines. So we can see the general layout, the general position of the esophagus and the stomach in these pictures here. Let's start with the oral cavity. I know this is about the esophagus and the stomach, but let's start with the oral cavity. We've got the oral cavity here. We can see the tongue. So food is coming in this direction, where the teeth are going to be chewing, going to be breaking down this food into ever smaller portions. And we can see that within the oral cavity, this process of cutting and chewing, this mechanical digestion has started. This mixes with saliva, allowing the chemical digestion to start as well. And then during the process of swallowing, this food is passed into the pharynx, which we can see here. Remember I said the trachea is anterior, so here we've got our neck, and we can see the trachea is anteriorly, and directly behind the trachea we see the esophagus, which is running down in this direction. So the food is converted to this bolus, which is swallowed into the esophagus via the pharynx. It's then going to descend through the thorax and pierces the diaphragm. And for food to pass down through the esophagus, the muscular walls of the esophagus contract, and peristalsis carries that food inferiorly. So here we've got another view of the esophagus, its position within the thorax, and we can see anteriorly that it's impossible to see the esophagus with the stomach in position. And here I've highlighted in this anterior view the position of where the esophagus would be. If we look at the posterior view, then we can see the diaphragm here. We can see the outline of the posterior aspect of the heart here, sitting on the diaphragm. And we can see this large blood vessel here, that is our aorta. And we can see running inferiorly down, we have our esophagus. It's running directly behind the posterior surface of the heart. And then it's going to enter into the abdomen by passing through the diaphragm. And it passes through the diaphragm, as we'll come to see, at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. We can see that here. If we just briefly look at the blood supply to the esophagus, this really comes from esophageal branches directly from the aorta. The aorta is running alongside the esophagus in the thorax, and small branches come away from the aorta to supply the esophagus, which we can see here. The esophagus then pierces through the diaphragm at what I said was the 10th thoracic vertebral level, and then it quickly joins into the stomach at the esophagocardiac junction, and this occurs at about the 11th thoracic vertebral level. So we can see the esophagus within the thorax, penetrating the diaphragm, enter the abdomen to then be continuous with the stomach. So here we can see that in more detail. We can see we have the diaphragm here. We've got a slightly elevated diaphragm. The right dome is slightly elevated on the right because of the liver. And we can see that going through the diaphragm, we have three important apertures. We have one for the inferior vena cava, the so-called caval opening, that occurs at the level of T8. We then have the aorta that passes through the diaphragm. We've got the thoracic aorta passing through the diagram. On this inferior view, we can see it here, aorta passing through. This occurs at T12, level of the 12th thoracic vertebra. Here's our caval opening occurring at T10, at T8, the 8th thoracic vertebral level, and then we can see we've got our esophageal hiatus, which enables the esophagus to pass through, and that occurs at T10, the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. So the inferior vena cava at T8, the esophagus at T10, and the aorta at T12. So let's move on now to the stomach. The stomach is specialized for this mechanical and chemical digestion. So it's a muscular sac that churns and contracts and squashes and, like I say, churns this ingested bolus of food. It also carries out significant chemical digestion. The release of pepsinogen, which is an enzyme which is converted into pepsin, helps to break down along with other gastric juices. And it converts this bolus of food into a semi-liquid, which is known as chyme. If we look at the diagram, we can see here we've got the esophagus joining the stomach, and this region of the stomach we know as the cardiac region. So this region here is known as the cardiac region, and it opens up via the cardiac orifice. That's the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. We can then look at some other regions of the stomach superior to this junction. This region here, we have the fundus. So we have the fundus in this region here. We have the cardiac region here. The fundus is usually filled with gas that's being produced via this chemical digestion. And then we have this large space in here, which is the body of the stomach. And we can see on the internal structure of the stomach, it's thrown into these series of folds called rugae. And that helps to increase the ability of the stomach to distend, alter in size. We've got these elevations. We can also see in this region here, we have what's known as the pylorus. And this is a narrowing of the body of the stomach that leads it towards the duodenum. And importantly, in this region, we have what's known as the pyloric sphincter. A really important sphincter that regulates the passage of chyme through this space into the duodenum, and that's the pyloric sphincter. When the pressure within the stomach becomes so high, then food passes through, this chyme passes through this sphincter, enabling it to carry on through the gastrointestinal tract and for it to be digested. We can also recognize a few other landmarks or boundaries, external features of the stomach. We have this nice long curvature around here. That's called the greater curvature, and we'll appreciate a series of blood vessels that run along here later on. And we can also see that here we have the lesser curvature, and that's an important landmark as it has a peritoneal attachment with the liver. We can see we have other structures like the cardiac notch, this junction between the fundus and the esophagus, and we can see where the lesser curvature tapers down towards the pylorus. We have the angular incisure, so we can see that down here. On this side of the screen, we can actually see this muscular bag and all its smooth muscle fibers arranged either longitudinally or arranged kind of circular that surround the muscle. And these muscles contracting enable that mechanical digestion to occur. So we can see the various layers of muscles that are surrounding the stomach. If we look at the internal surface of the stomach, so here we can see a section through the stomach. We've got the outer surface of the stomach here, and we've got the internal surface here. We can see in this thickness of the stomach, we can see the various muscle layers. We can see the circular and the longitudinal muscle layers we can see here. And we can also see the mucosa, this most inner lining of the stomach. And that's really important, this inner surface, this mucosa. It's important because it contains what are known as gastric pits. Gastric pits that communicate with some gastric glands. And deep within these gastric glands, we can just make out some gastric glands down in here, down at the very bottom of these pits. We can see these individual pits that open up onto the surface of the stomach. There's two types of cells. This isn't a physiology course, so we're not going into too much detail here. But briefly, these two different types of cells, these parietal and these chief cells, are important in that chemical digestion. The parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid. Secretes hydrochloric acid as protons, as hydrogen ions, and as chlorine ions into the lumen of the stomach. And this reduces the pH to around about 1 or 2. The importance of this is it kills microorganisms, it denatures proteins, and it helps to break down plant cell walls. It also, importantly, this acidic environment activates pepsin. Pepsin is released by this second group of cells called chief cells, and these secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is inactive. Pepsinogen is inactive, and it requires the acidic pH created by the parietal cells to become active. So the acidic lumen converts pepsinogen to pepsin, and it is the pepsin that breaks down proteins. So without this acidic lumen created by the parietal cells, proteins in the ingested bolus wouldn't be able to be digested. There's a problem: stomach ulcers. You've got these acid-producing cells, these parietal cells, creating acid within the lumen of the stomach. The problem is that the acid could burn away, could destroy the mucosal lining of the stomach. And in the diagram, we can see what is a gastric ulcer, an ulcer within the walls of the stomach. So there is a balance. There is a balance to be had between the acid in the lumen and the amount of mucus that is produced. To protect the lining of the stomach, a carpet of alkaline mucus is secreted by the epithelial layer of the stomach. So that produces mucus that lines the internal surface. So the acidic lumen cannot destroy, damage the internal surface. So there's a balance, which is depicted here. Reduction in mucus production or an increase in the acid content of the lumen can lead to perforation of the wall of the stomach. And that can be particularly nasty, can be particularly painful and very serious. Perforation, the contents of the stomach can leak into the peritoneal cavity, leading to peritonitis and infection. Hemorrhaging, if the perforation was to damage blood vessels, could lead to blood in your stools or vomiting out blood if you were to be sick. Bleed into the gastrointestinal tract and it's excreted is how we get it in our stools. Or if the ulcer repairs and you have some scarring, this can cause a blockage. And if the food can't progress down the gastrointestinal tract, then that can lead to a build-up of food within the stomach and you can have projectile vomiting. So although it's really important that we have this acid production in the lumen, it's also important we have this alkaline mucus and we have this balance to prevent the wall of the stomach from being damaged. Let's return to the more of the gross anatomy, the position of the stomach. And here we can see really nicely how the stomach is positioned in situ, how it's actually positioned if you were to open up one's abdomen and view it. The liver here has been lifted up slightly, but like I mentioned before, we can see the lesser curvature of the stomach here. We can see the greater curvature of the stomach here. Up here we've got the fundus, we've got the body, we've got the pylorus, and we've got the pyloric sphincter over here. Remember me saying that the lesser curvature was connected to the liver? Well, here we've got an important membrane that's connecting the stomach to the liver. We'll come across this in later lectures. It's really important. It's the lesser omentum, specifically the hepatogastric ligament of the lesser omentum. We'll come to that later on. So on this side of the screen, we can also see the relations of other organs to the stomach. So on this side, we can see what is the anterior view, and here we can see the posterior view. Now, you may not be familiar with the position of these organs, so it may not make a lot of sense right now, but by the end of the course, when we've spoken about these other regions, these other organs, you'll be able to imagine the precise position of the stomach. So we can see anteriorly, and this links very well to this diagram here. We can see we've got the liver here, and so we can see the liver is having this impression. If the liver had flopped down, if it hadn't been elevated, which we can see in this diagram, it would be lying over the stomach. Over here, we've got the diaphragm. So on this anterior surface of the stomach, we've got the diaphragm, which is coming down, covering this region here. So if you immediately open up the abdomen in this region, you find the stomach. And then down at the bottom, you just have other parts of the anterior abdominal wall where the diaphragm is finished. Importantly though, what does the stomach sit on? What's known as the stomach bed? What lies immediately posterior to the stomach? So for this, we've flopped the liver. We've flopped the stomach over, and posteriorly we can see we have relations to the spleen. So the stomach would be coming in this kind of position here. So immediately behind the stomach, we have the spleen, we have the kidney, we have the pancreas. We can also see in this region down here, we have the transverse mesocolon. We'll look at the transverse mesocolon in more detail later on. So we can see the position and the relations of the stomach to the other abdominal organs. In order for the stomach to work, it needs to have oxygen to make the cells work so they can respire, create energy so they can carry out their function. And it also needs to have venous drainage. So we're going to look at the vasculature of the stomach. And importantly, you just need to remember again the lesser curvature and the greater curvature running around the right and the left borders of the stomach. So we can see that if we concentrate on the lesser curvature, we have two what are known as gastric blood vessels. The left and the right gastric blood vessels. These come either directly or indirectly from an important blood vessel known as the celiac trunk. And we'll cover this in later lectures where we look holistically at all of the blood vessels at once because it makes more sense that way. But individually, running along the lesser curvature, we find we have the left gastric artery and we find we have the right gastric artery. And these arteries will form a complete circuit along this lesser curvature, the two gastric arteries. We can then see with this greater curvature, we have two more blood vessels. We have the left gastroamental and the right gastroamental. And these are going to be coming in this direction and this direction, right and left gastroamental arteries. And again, these will join to form a circuit around this greater curvature. So how can you remember your greater curvature and your lesser curvature vasculature? Well, gastric is a short word gastric for the lesser curvature, the small of the two curvatures. Gastroamental is a longer word, and that runs around the longer, greater curvature. You can also see we have some short gastric blood vessels that supply the fundus, and these come off the splenic artery, which we'll see later on. The venous drainage mirrors the arterial supply. So if you're happy with the arterial supply, then just convert the word artery to vein, and you have gastric veins and you have gastroamental veins. These pass back to the liver via what's known as the portal system. And again, we'll cover that in more detail. So this is the vasculature of the stomach. We also need to look at how the stomach's activity is controlled. And to do that, we look at the nerve supply. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the autonomic nervous system. This is part of the nervous system that we're not consciously in control of, not like the somatic nervous system, which controls the skeletal muscle that allows me to contract biceps. The autonomic nervous system is ticking over all of the time. And we can see here in purple and in green, we have two different parts of it. We have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Now, for the stomach, its activity is controlled by the autonomic innervation, and increases of its activity are controlled via the parasympathetic nervous system. This increases activity. This will increase the rate of peristalsis, increase the production of acid, the release of Pepsinogen. And it's controlled by the main parasympathetic nerve of the body, the vagus nerve. This enters into the abdomen. The vagus nerve starts high up in the neck at the base of the brain from a region called the medulla, and it passes down the thorax, enters the abdomen via the esophageal hiatus, and then it spreads over the surface of the stomach. It also gives branches to what's known as the celiac plexus, and we'll cover that in a later class because that controls other parts of the abdominal viscera. So this vagus nerve controls the activity of the stomach, and it really increases the activity. Once you've had dinner, you go and sit down in the lounge and do any kind of activity. The digestion of the food is controlled by the parasympathetic via the vagus nerve. If you want the activity to go down, so if you're doing activities that don't really require your stomach to work that heavy, then that's why the sympathetic division. Okay, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system dampened down the activity of the stomach. And this is via a nerve called the greater splanchnic nerve. And we'll look at splanchnic nerves again in greater detail when we cover the nerve supply, and which we can see here. The autonomic nerves are going to be covered in more detail in lecture 20. So don't worry too much right now if you're not quite fully comfortable with these. We will go over it in greater detail in the last lecture of this abdominopelvic series. So in conclusion, we've looked at the esophagus and the stomach. We've looked at the location of both of these within both the thoracic cavity, where it's relevant for the esophagus, and the abdominal cavities. We then looked at the esophagus and stomach individually with their blood supply and how the esophagus enters into the abdomen. And then the stomach, where we looked at its various muscular layers, regions, curvatures. We looked at gastric ulcers. And then towards the end, we looked at the vasculature and nervous control of the stomach.